the Alaska snow beast. I've been driving trucks for most of my life, hauling loads across the country. There's nothing glamorous about it, just long, lonely roads and endless stretches of snow and asphalt. But there are nights, especially in places like Alaska, where the silence feels heavier and the cold seems to seep deeper into your bones. That night in Alaska was one of those. I'm Jack Corbin. I was with a crew of 4 that night, 2 trucks, 2 drivers apiece, hauling freight from Anchorage to Fairbanks. It was late December, the dead of winter, and the kind of cold that made your breath freeze before it even left your mouth. The road we were on was long and isolated, the kind of place where no one could hear you scream if something went wrong. We were driving the Alaskan Highway, or what passed for it this far north. The road was winding and uneven, coated with a thick layer of snow and ice, and the trees along the sides of the road were bent under the weight of it, the kind of cold that makes your eyes water and your bones ache. But we were used to it. We didn't have much choice. The night was quieter than usual, the sort of dead silence that seems unnatural. The engine hum in the cab was the only sound for miles. We were all lost in our own thoughts. When Tom, he was driving the lead truck, spoke up. "Did you guys see that?" His voice crackled through the radio, but the hesitation in it made my gut twist. "What?" I answered, keeping my eyes on the road, the headlights barely cutting through the swirling snow. That thing." Tom's voice sounded shaken, like he wasn't sure what he had seen. "What thing?" A shadow, big, fast, crossed the road right in front of me. Something huge. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my heart picking up speed. The snow was coming down harder now, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. "You sure it wasn't an elk?" I asked, trying to dismiss the thought. But I knew it wasn't. The way he sounded, the fear in his voice. It wasn't an elk. "I don't know, Jack. It was too fast. And it wasn't an animal. It was moving like a person, but bigger." I thought about that for a moment. The road was notorious for wildlife, but I had never seen anything move that fast. Still, I wasn't about to get spooked. "Keep your eyes peeled," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll be at the checkpoint soon." We didn't talk much after that, but my mind kept racing. Something about Tom's voice, the way he sounded, kept me on edge. There was no reason for us to be out here. It was too damn cold, and if we didn't have to deliver the load, I would have turned around and headed home in a heartbeat. But we were here, and now there was something out there, something that didn't belong. About an hour later, we saw it, a flash in the darkness, something large and fast, darting across the road in front of Tom's truck. The snow was too thick to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It wasn't an elk, and it wasn't a bear. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Tom slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. I did the same, the trucks groaning under the strain of the stop. I flicked on my high beams, and for a moment, all I could see was snow, swirling in the cold night air. Then, there it was, a massive, hulking shape at least 7 feet tall, sprinting across the road. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and it moved with an unnatural speed. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature was carrying something, draped over its shoulder. It looked like a deer, or maybe something bigger, but I couldn't make out the details in the dark. Its eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light, and the air around it seemed to shimmer, like the temperature had dropped even further. Before I could react, it was gone, vanishing into the woods as quickly as it had appeared. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Tom's voice crackled through the radio again, sounding even more frantic this time. "You saw that, didn't you?" he asked, his breath heavy with panic. "Yeah," I said, barely able to find my voice. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know, but we need to stop. Now," I agreed, but I didn't want to. There was something about that creature, something primal that told me we were in way over our heads. But the trucks came to a halt, and we all piled out, our boots sinking into the deep snow. The air was biting, and I could barely feel my face, but we had to know what we were dealing with. The first thing we noticed were the tracks. Gigantic footprints, almost 3 feet long, imprinted deep into the snow. They were moving in the direction the creature had gone, and they were too big to belong to any animal I knew. We followed them for a while, trying to make sense of the trail, but it was clear that whatever had made these prints wasn't a typical animal. The way the tracks spread out, the way they dug into the snow, it wasn't right. Then we saw it. In the snow, a patch of red, blood, fresh blood, still wet in the freezing cold. It led us further into the trees, and the closer we got, the more I could feel something was wrong. The woods had gone silent, unnervingly silent. No animals, no wind, no nothing. I stopped when I saw the deer, or at least what used to be a deer. Its body was mangled, its ribs crushed, its flesh torn apart in a way that was too violent, too savage for any predator. But it wasn't just the animal that caught my attention. No, it was what was standing next to it. A massive figure, cloaked in shadow, watching us from just beyond the trees. The creature was back. This time, we saw it more clearly. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with arms that hung down to its knees. Its fur was thick and matted, the color of midnight. The eyes gleamed yellow, like some animal from a nightmare. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. Like the whole world had stopped spinning and all that was left was this thing, watching us, waiting, couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't make my legs move. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and disappeared into the forest. The snow around us fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our heavy breathing. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. The creature had made its point. We weren't welcome here. We weren't even supposed to know about it. We got back to the trucks, never once looking back. We didn't take any more risks. We made sure to leave that place behind us and never speak of it again. But the images stayed with me, the creature's glowing eyes, the blood-streaked snow, the way it moved like something ancient, something that had been waiting in those dark forests for a long time. When we finally made it to Fairbanks, we didn't tell anyone what we had seen. You can't explain something like that. The locals, of course, knew. They always do. They call it the Alaska Snow Beast, or simply the Beast. And they know better than to venture too far into the wilderness during the dead of winter. Me, I never drove through that stretch of highway again. And I don't recommend you do, either, because there's something out there. Something that's been living in those frozen forests for centuries. Something that doesn't want us to know it exists. And it's always watching, waiting. Story number 2. Shadows in the Siberian forest. I've always believed that the Siberian wilderness holds secrets best left undisturbed. My name is Ivan Petrov, and in the winter of 1952, I was part of a hunting party that ventured deep into the heart of Siberia, a journey that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The frost bit at our cheeks as we trudged through the knee-deep snow, our breath forming small clouds that vanished into the crisp air. The pine trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow that glistened under the pale sunlight. There were 5 of us: Victor, the seasoned leader; Mikhail, the jovial storyteller; Sergei, quiet but sharp-eyed; Nikolai, the youngest but eager; and myself, content to follow and learn. We had set out to hunt elk, a necessary expedition to provide for our families in the harsh winter months. The village we came from was small, a cluster of wooden houses warmed by hearth fires and close-knit community. The Siberian taiga was our backyard, a place we thought we knew intimately, but that belief was shattered on the 3rd day of our journey. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the tracks. Victor was the first to spot them. Massive footprints pressed deep into the snow, each one larger than any animal track we'd ever seen. The prints were humanoid but enormous, with 5 toes splayed out like a bear's but distinctly different. "What do you make of this?" Nikolai asked, his voice tinged with awe and a hint of fear. Victor knelt beside the track, running his gloved hand around its edge. "I don't know," he admitted, his brow furrowed. "But whatever made this is big. Very big." Mikhail attempted to lighten the mood. "Perhaps it's the Leshy playing tricks on us," he chuckled, referring to the forest spirit from old folklore. But none of us laughed. We decided to follow the tracks, curiosity and a sense of duty compelling us forward. If there was a new predator in the area, the village needed to know. The footprints led us deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the light struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. As dusk approached, the shadows stretched long and dark, and an unsettling silence enveloped the forest. Even the usual sounds of wildlife were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. "Maybe we should head back," Sergei suggested. "Set up camp and continue in the morning." Victor considered this and nodded. "You're right. We'll lose the light soon." We found a small clearing sheltered by towering pines and set up our tents. A fire was built, and we huddled around it, the flames offering warmth and a semblance of comfort. Mikhail began telling one of his stories, but his usual enthusiasm was dampened. Our minds were elsewhere, fixated on the mysterious tracks. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees with a haunting melody. I retreated into my tent, wrapping myself tightly in blankets. Sleep came fitfully. Sometime deep into the night, I awoke to a sound, a low, distant rumble that resonated through the ground. I sat up, straining to listen. The rumble grew louder, evolving into a guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Voices murmured outside as the others emerged from their tents. I joined them, and we stood together, illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. "What was that?" Nikolai whispered, his eyes wide. Before anyone could answer, a deafening roar tore through the silence. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and primal, filled with rage and warning. The trees shook, snow cascading from their branches. "Over there," Sergei shouted, pointing into the darkness. We saw it, a massive silhouette standing between the trees, illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight. The creature was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick white fur that blended seamlessly with the snow. Its eyes reflected the firelight, 2 burning orbs that locked onto us with an intelligence that was terrifying. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. None of us moved or even breathed. Then Victor snapped out of the trance. "Back away slowly," he commanded in a hushed tone. "Do not turn your back." We began to retreat, our movements careful and deliberate. The creature watched us, its gaze unbroken. Then it took a step forward, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. "Run!" Victor shouted. We didn't hesitate, dropping what we couldn't carry. We sprinted through the forest, the creature's roar echoing behind us. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, overriding the cold and the fatigue. Branches whipped at my face, and the snow grabbed at my boots. But I pushed on, driven by pure fear. We didn't stop until we burst into a clearing far from our camp. Gasping for breath, we collapsed onto the snow. "Is everyone here?" Victor panted. We did a quick head count. All 5 of us had made it. "What was that thing?" Mikhail asked, his voice shaking. No one had an answer. "We need to get back to the village," Victor said. "Warn the others." "But our supplies," Nikolai began. "Leave them," Victor cut him off. "It's not safe." The first light. We began the journey home. The return trip was grueling. The encounter had shaken us, and the weight of what we'd seen pressed heavily on our spirits. We moved quickly, speaking little. When we finally reached the village, we recounted our tale to the elders. Some dismissed it as fear-induced hallucinations. Others exchanged worried glances, whispering about old legends best forgotten. Against the advice of the elders, Victor decided to return to the campsite the next day to retrieve our supplies and look for evidence. I volunteered to go with him, as did Sergei. Mikhail and Nikolai chose to stay behind. Armed with fresh courage and the daylight on our side, we retraced our steps to the campsite. The area was eerily quiet, our belongings scattered and partially buried in snow. The fire pit was smothered, and the tents were torn apart. What could have done this? Sergei murmured. We searched for tracks, and soon found them, massive footprints identical to the ones we'd seen before. They circled the campsite and then led off deeper into the forest. Look at this, Victor said, picking up a torn piece of fabric. Deep gashes scored the ground nearby, as if something with enormous claws had raked through the snow and soil. Let's follow the tracks, Victor suggested. I hesitated. Is that wise? He met my gaze. We need to know what we're dealing with. Reluctantly, I agreed. We followed the footprints, which eventually led us to a cave entrance carved into a rocky hillside. A foul odor emanated from within, a mix of decay and something else, something primal. Stay alert, Victor whispered, drawing his rifle. We entered the cave slowly, the darkness swallowing us. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing walls adorned with deep scratches. Bones littered the floor, some animal, others disturbingly large. A growl echoed from the depths, and before we could react, the creature emerged from the shadows. It stood taller than before, its white fur matted with blood. Its eyes burned with anger. We raised our rifles, but the creature was fast, too fast. It swiped at Victor, sending him crashing into the wall. Sergei fired a shot, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet grazed the creature's shoulder, causing it to roar in pain. Run, Victor gasped, clutching his side. We didn't argue. Sergei and I bolted for the exit, half dragging Victor between us. The creature's footsteps thundered behind us. Just as we burst into the open air, the entrance collapsed, whether by chance or design. I couldn't tell, blocking the creature's pursuit. We didn't stop running until we reached the village. Victor was taken to the healer, his injuries severe but not life-threatening. We told the elders what had happened. This time, they listened. That is the Almas, one of the oldest villagers said gravely, an ancient being, protector of the forest. You have trespassed into its domain. We didn't know, pleaded. We meant no harm. Intent matters little, the elder replied. You have seen it, and now it knows you. Fear settled over the village like a shroud. Precautions were taken, doors reinforced, patrols established, but deep down, we knew it was futile. Over the following weeks, strange occurrences plagued us. Livestock disappeared, ominous howls echoed at night, and shadows moved at the edge of the forest. One morning, Nikolai was gone, his bed untouched, no signs of struggle. A single set of massive footprints led from his doorstep into the forest. Desperation gripped us. Some suggested leaving, abandoning the village that had been our home for generations. Others insisted on standing our ground. In the end, the decision was made for us. On a moonless night, the creature came. It tore through the village with a ferocity unmatched. Buildings reduced to splinters. Fires ignited in the chaos. We fought back, but our weapons were useless against its might. I remember the screams, the terror that enveloped us. I fled into the forest, the irony not lost on me. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing beneath the tree. When dawn broke, I returned to find the village decimated. Survivors were few. Among them was Mikhail, his spirit broken. We should never have disturbed it, he whispered, eyes hollow. We gathered what we could and left. The place we once called home, now a graveyard of memories. Years have passed since that fateful winter. I live in a town far from those cursed woods, but the nightmares follow me. I see its eyes in every shadow, hear its roar in every storm. I share this tale as a warning. The Siberian wilderness holds secrets, ancient and unforgiving. There are places man was never meant to tread, beings we were never meant to encounter. If you ever find yourself in those remote forests, and you come across footprints too large to be real. Turn back, leave and never return. Some legends are real, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Story number 3. The hunter story in Montana. I was never much of a believer in the supernatural. Not until that winter. Not until I walked through the woods in Montana, alone, hunting for game, and found something that doesn't belong in any of the stories I knew. The ones we tell to scare ourselves around campfires. That's where I learned that some things can't be explained. Some things, they just are. It was December of 1995, and the snow had been relentless for days. I'd been hunting for nearly a week, covering the same old ground I always do, deep into the thick forests near the Flathead River, well away from the small towns that dotted the edges of the state. I knew the land like the back of my hand. Every ridge, every trail, every tree. I knew when the elk would be grazing near the ridges, where the deer would huddle in the underbrush to escape the winter chill. I was alone, but that was how I liked it. Solitude was always part of the hunt, part of what made it feel real. I had been trekking through the snow for a few hours that morning, the heavy winter air biting at my skin. When I found the tracks, fresh, there was something about the way they pressed into the snow that made my instincts flare up. The hooves were big, bigger than any deer I'd ever tracked, and they were deep, as though whatever had made them was heavy, moving with purpose. I followed them, moving slower now, listening for any sound above the wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. My breath misted in the frigid air, and my rifle felt like a lead weight in my hands. I'd learned to trust my instincts over the years. If something felt off, it usually was. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened, a storm threatening to roll in. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, thickening the air and blurring the line between the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I hadn't heard anything for a while, and the silence hung heavy around me, suffocating in a way I couldn't quite explain. That's when I felt it. First, it was just a sense, a prickle on the back of my neck, a coldness in the air that didn't belong. You know that feeling, the one you get when you're being watched, when every hair on your body stands up. It was like that, but more intense, more primal. Couldn't shake it. Someone or something was out there, watching me. I froze, trying to listen. There was nothing. No sound at all except for the occasional gust of wind rustling the bare branches of the trees. I turned slowly, scanning the trees behind me, but there was nothing. No movement, just shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to do that when you've been out in the wild for days on end. Your mind's starting to play tricks on you. I kept moving, following the tracks, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. First, it was just a flash, a shape moving between the trees. My heart skipped. I knew it wasn't a deer. The movement was too fluid, too large, and then I saw it. A figure stepped into the clearing ahead, emerging from the thick snow-covered underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. I barely dared to believe what I was seeing. It was tall, massive, even over 2 meters. I'd say his fur was a dark brown, matted from the snow, with patches of lighter fur around the chest and underarms. But what struck me most were its eyes. There was no mistaking them. They were wide, round, and they stared directly at me. No blink, no movement, just a gaze that cut right through me, as though it could see every single part of me, every flaw, every doubt. I stood frozen, my hand tight on the rifle, but I didn't raise it. I didn't know why. Maybe it was because I knew instinctively that whatever this thing was, it wasn't a threat, not yet. It just watched me, like it was studying me, measuring me, deciding whether or not I was worth its time. The seconds stretched on, becoming minutes. The air was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that fills you with dread. The creature didn't make a sound. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me as if waiting for me to make the first move. And then, without warning, turned, slowly, methodically, like it had made its decision. The creature began to move, walking silently between the trees, its long limbs shifting gracefully in the snow. I don't know why, but I followed it. I couldn't help myself. Something deep inside me told me to follow, to understand. It led me further into the woods. I don't know how long I walked, or how far. My mind was spinning, caught between disbelief and fear. What was this thing? What was it doing here? I had heard stories, of course, old tales from the locals about strange creatures in the mountains, about things that were never meant to be, but I'd always dismissed them, like anyone does with superstitions. But this wasn't a superstition. This was real. The creature stopped abruptly, just ahead, where the trees gave way to a dense thicket of underbrush. It was as if it knew I was there, knew I'd followed it, paused, glanced back over its shoulder at me one last time, and then stepped deeper into the shadows, vanishing into the snow-covered forest. For a moment, I stood there in complete silence. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I turned and walked back toward my camp. The tracks were gone. The creature's footsteps, the massive prints I had been following, had disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun had begun to set. The sky was darkening, and the snow continued to fall in soft, steady flakes, but inside, I felt anything but safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, staring into the darkness outside, my rifle always within reach. I kept thinking about the creature, the way it looked at me, the way it moved through the snow, and I couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't done with me. The next day, I packed up and left. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Couldn't. No one would have believed me. Besides, what would I have said? That I saw something in the woods, something that shouldn't exist? But I know what I saw, and I know that it's still out there, waiting in the snow-covered forests of Montana. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can hear its footsteps, a sound that feels like it's getting closer, step by step. Story number 4. The roar of the night. It was supposed to be a simple family camping trip, a getaway, the kind of trip we used to take when the kids were younger, before life got too busy, before the weight of the world made it feel like we could never truly escape. But in the winter of 1986, my family and I decided to return to a place we hadn't visited in years, the snow-covered forests of northern Canada. It was my wife, Carol, and me, along with our 2 kids, Brian, who was 14, and little Kate, just 8 years old. It felt good to pack the car and leave the cluttered noise of the city behind. We spent hours driving, winding through the snow-lined roads that seemed endless. And by the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The trees were thick and towering, their trunks coated with frost. It was the kind of place where silence didn't just fall, it pressed down on you, heavy and suffocating, like the air itself was frozen. The smell of pine filled the air as we set up camp, pitching the tent, starting the fire, and unpacking the gear. It was a peaceful night, too peaceful, maybe. We cooked dinner on a small camping stove and spent the evening huddled around the fire, talking, laughing, and just enjoying the quiet. The stars above were impossibly bright, like tiny diamonds scattered across a dark velvet sky. Felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. But there was something in the air that night, something I couldn't shake. The silence around us felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. I noticed it first when I stepped away from the fire to gather more firewood. The air was colder than usual, and the snow beneath my boots made no sound at all, not even a crunch. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, so deep it seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet. It was distant at first, barely more than a whisper carried by the wind, but then it came again, louder, closer, and unmistakably real. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to the campfire, where Carol and the kids were talking. They hadn't heard it yet. The growl rang out again, and this time I could feel it in my chest, as if the sound itself was vibrating in the marrow of my bones. My first thought was a bear. We had camped in bear country before, and the idea of a hungry animal searching for food wasn't entirely out of the question. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the edge of the camp. The growl came again, so close now that I could feel it reverberating in my ribcage. My mind raced. Was it a bear? No, couldn't be. The sound was wrong, too deep, too powerful. Bears didn't make that kind of noise. I stood at the edge of the trees, staring into the blackness beyond. The snow around me reflected the light from the campfire, but the forest beyond seemed like a wall of darkness. And then I saw something, a shadow moving, just outside the reach of the light. A shape, large and towering, loomed in the distance. First, I thought it was a trick of the light, some odd reflection or a figment of my imagination. But then the shape moved, stepping closer, the silhouette clearer now. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. It was a creature at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur that looked almost white in the moonlight. Its eyes gleamed red, fiery, glowing in the darkness, like embers burning deep in its skull. It stood there, watching us, watching me. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a slow, shallow breath. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. The creature let out another roar, this time much louder, a sound that shook the trees and rattled my very bones. The ground vibrated beneath me, and the roar seemed to echo through the entire forest, as if the forest itself was answering back. The sound was so powerful that I couldn't think, couldn't process it, couldn't move. It was primal, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of some ancient, forgotten place. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the trees, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The roar died away, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the wind whistling through the trees and the soft crackling of the fire. I stood there for a moment, frozen. My mind was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell had I just seen? I turned slowly and made my way back to the camp, my hands trembling as I gripped the flashlight. I tried to push the image of those glowing eyes from my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. I didn't know what to say to Carol, to Brian, to Kate. How could I explain something like that? They hadn't heard the growl. They hadn't seen what I had seen. When I returned to the camp, I tried to act normal, tried to push the fear away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching us. I sat down next to Carol and tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, on the normal sounds of the night, but I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line, where the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing everything in its wake. The night passed slowly, and we eventually crawled into the tent to sleep. I lay awake, unable to relax, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind howled through the trees. The snow creaked beneath the weight of the world. And somewhere far in the distance, I heard it again, a low, rumbling growl, faint, but unmistakable. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the sound came again, closer now, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against the walls of the tent. The growl echoed through the forest, louder this time, until it was as though the very air itself was vibrating with it. And then came the worst part. The ground outside the tent shook, and a sound, heavy footsteps, crunching through the snow, sounded just beyond the canvas walls. Something was circling us, something big. Carol stirred beside me, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my mind trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could feel them beneath my skin. And then, without warning, a massive thud echoed against the tent wall, a blow so powerful that the entire structure shook. I reached for my flashlight, but it was too late. The creature was here. The growl came again, so close now I could feel it in my chest. I could hear the ragged breath, the sound of something panting, as though whatever it was waiting for something, waiting for us. And then, in the darkness, I saw it, two glowing red eyes, staring through the tent, watching us. The creature was right outside, so close I could almost feel its breath on my face. In that moment, we knew that we weren't going to make it out of this forest alive. The eyes stared at us for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it had come, the creature was gone. When morning came, we found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. The forest was still, silent once more, but I knew what I had seen. We all did, and when we left that campsite, we didn't speak of it again. But sometimes, in the quietest moments, I can still hear the growl, and I wonder what was it? What was out there in the woods, watching us, waiting for us? And more importantly, is it still out there? Story number 5. The snowman attacks the camp. I'll never forget the night we camped in the Rockies. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a group of friends getting away from the city, out into the vast wilderness of Colorado to escape the noise, the chaos, and everything else that clung to our lives. But that night, the mountains taught us something we couldn't unlearn, something we'll never forget. It was late March, still deep into winter. The snow was heavy, blanketing the world in silence. Our group, a mix of old college friends and new faces, had rented a cabin high up in the Rockies, far from the hustle of the tourist towns below. It wasn't the most glamorous of cabins, more of a shack really, but it had that rustic charm we were looking for, and a fireplace that gave the place an eerie warmth. We spent the first day hiking, drinking beers, and talking about our lives. But by evening, we decided to set up a campsite just outside the cabin. Away from the warmth of the fire, we pitched tents near a small, frozen lake, the kind of place you see in a postcard, beautiful, but cold. The moon was full, and the air was crisp, with only the sounds of the wind in the trees and the occasional animal rustling in the underbrush. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Not that night. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of rocks hitting our tents. First, I thought I was dreaming, something that happens when you're in the mountains, surrounded by strange noises in the night. But then the rocks hit harder, followed by a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath me. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a bear. No, this was something much worse. I unzipped my tent cautiously, barely breathing. Outside, everything was still covered in snow, but in the pale light of the moon, I saw the figure, a massive shape, moving through the trees. It was huge, its silhouette towering over the forest. It stood just inside the tree line, its eyes glowing like twin embers, its chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. It was looking straight at us. I turned back to my tent, panic creeping up my spine. "Get up," I whispered, shaking my friend Jake awake. "Something's out there." His eyes shot open, but before he could say anything, we heard the growl again, louder this time, closer. The ground beneath us trembled as if something was charging toward us, shaking the trees. Then came something huge crashing through the woods. The sound was deafening. It wasn't running. It was walking, deliberately, with the power of a freight train. "Grab your stuff," I shouted, but no one moved fast enough. Panic had set in, and it was too late to pack up anything. The thing outside was getting closer, close enough that we could hear it pounding through the snow, getting nearer with every breath. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, like a thunderclap in the still night air. I turned, and the first thing I saw was a massive boulder flying through the air, hurling toward our camp. It struck one of the tents, the fabric tearing apart like paper. A scream cut through the night. Jessica, one of our friends, had been caught under the falling tent. The rest of us scrambled to get her out. But the boulder was just the beginning. The creature, whatever it was, let out a roar that rattled our bones. I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. We had no choice. We turned and ran, leaving everything behind: sleeping bags, gear, even our phones. We just ran. I don't know how far we ran. Felt like we were running forever, like we were running from the very mountains themselves. All I could hear was the wind in my ears and the thudding of my own feet on the snow. Behind us, there was a terrible noise: branches breaking, trees crashing down, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, following us. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin. Breathless and terrified, we piled into the small living room, locking every door and shuttering every window. But even then, it didn't feel safe. The air felt wrong, heavy, like we were being watched. For the rest of the night, we could hear it soft at first, then louder. The thing was out there, moving through the trees. We could hear the crunch of snow beneath its feet, the occasional roar in the distance, and worst of all, the sound of something throwing rocks, banging against the cabin walls. It wanted us out there in the snow, wanted us to face it, but none of us were brave enough to go back. We stayed in that cabin until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, we made a decision. We had to go back to the campsite. We had to see if we could recover anything. We couldn't just leave everything behind. The hike back was miserable. The snow had stopped, but the air was thick with the lingering terror of the night before. When we finally arrived at the camp, we were all in shock. Everything was gone. The tents were shredded. The gear was scattered across the forest floor, and there were massive footprints, deep, wide footprints that seemed to go on forever, leading into the trees. These weren't animal tracks. No bear, no moose. Nothing of this earth could have made them. They were humanoid, impossibly large, and covered in snow, like something from a nightmare. I tried to take a few steps toward where our campfire had been. I don't know why, but I needed to see it. I needed to understand what had happened to us. And that's when I saw it. Something in the snow near the edge of the lake. First, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, my heart sank. There, in the snow, were the remnants of what I can only describe as a symbol, a massive, crude drawing scratched into the ground. It was shaped like a person, but distorted, with long limbs that twisted in unnatural directions. And in the center of it, written in the snow, 3 words: "IT is watching." I stumbled back, panic rising in my throat. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the symbol. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. We didn't need to be told twice. We made our way back to the cabin as quickly as we could. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That thing was still out there, watching us. We never spoke about what happened again. When we got back to town, we tried to explain, tried to tell people what we saw, but no one believed us. They just shrugged it off as some kind of wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion that had gotten too close. But we knew better. We knew what we saw, what we felt. And now, every winter, I can't shake the feeling. Every time I hear a rustling in the trees, or when the wind picks up and howls through the forest, I can hear it again. The roar, the thudding footsteps, the thing that watches from the trees, the snowman. And I know it's waiting for me. It's waiting for all of us. Story number 6. The snowman of the Andes. The Andes, the towering, ice-capped mountains that seem to pierce the heavens, with their jagged peaks and ancient glaciers. Place of beauty, sure, but also a place where the unknown lurks in every shadow. A place where the earth itself seems to whisper secrets to those who dare to listen. I was one of those fools who thought he could conquer it, one of those overconfident souls who believed that the mountains could be tamed. I remember that day clearly, like it happened only yesterday. My friends and I had been planning our ascent of Mount Aconcagua for months. We were experienced climbers, each of us having tackled peaks across the world. But nothing prepared us for what we would encounter on that mountain. not even the stories. We had set out in the early morning, when the world was still asleep, the sky barely starting to turn a soft shade of pink. The air was thin up there, and even the lightest steps felt like they were taking every bit of energy I had. But we were used to it. We had been climbing in the Andes for days, but that morning was different. That morning, the mountains were heavy, not physically, of course, but in a way that settled deep in your gut, gnawing at you until you couldn't think straight. The winds picked up around midday, swirling in unpredictable gusts. Our guide, Sergio, who had been up these slopes more times than I could count, told us that the weather was turning for the worse. He seemed uneasy, more uneasy than I had ever seen him, but he didn't say much about it. He just told us to keep moving, to keep climbing, and to stay close. We continued our ascent, pushing through the cold, the wind, the shifting snow. There was a sense of isolation here, in the heart of the Andes, where the world seemed to fall away into nothingness. I glanced at my friends, Matt, Chris, and Laura, all seasoned climbers. Yet each of us felt the weight of something wrong. It was Chris who first saw it. We were moving up a narrow ridge, the snowpack trail barely wide enough for one person. The wind was howling, the snow swirling around us in thick, blinding sheets. Chris called out, his voice cutting through the storm like a knife. "Hey, do you guys see that?" We stopped, squinting into the whiteout, trying to make sense of what he was pointing at. First, we thought it was another climber, someone else who had strayed from their group, perhaps struggling in the storm, but there was something off about it. It wasn't moving like a person. It was standing on the slope, just beyond the reach of our vision, towering against the white backdrop of the mountain. It didn't look like any climber I had ever seen. It was too tall, unnaturally tall, and its posture was wrong. The way it stood, half turned to face us, was almost predatory. I raised my binoculars, my hands shaking from both the cold and the unease settling in my stomach. The figure stood at least 8 feet tall, his body thick and bulky, far larger than any human I had ever encountered. The air felt denser, heavier, as if the very presence of the thing was sucking the life out of the wind. I could see its outline clearly now. Despite the snowstorm, the shape of its broad shoulders, the way its legs moved with a strange, deliberate grace, and most haunting of all, the eyes. Even from this distance, I could see that they were wrong. Not the dark, reflective eyes of a man, but eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light, like 2 pieces of glowing coal. Matt was the first to speak. "That's not a person." We all knew it then. It wasn't a person. Couldn't be. We turned to Sergio, but even he was silent, his face ashen beneath his hood. "We need to go back," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Now, at that moment, I didn't question him. I didn't need to. I felt it in my bones, the urgent pull to leave, to retreat into the safety of the known, away from whatever that thing was. But as we started to turn, the creature moved. It didn't walk. It glided, its feet barely touching the ground as it shifted effortlessly across the snow, as if it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity like we were. My heart slammed into my chest, and I felt the cold sweat of fear on my brow. We began to move faster, scrambling back down the slope, but we didn't make it far before we heard it loud, like a howl carried by the wind, but deep, a sound that rattled my chest, sending tremors through my body. "Run!" Sergio yelled, and we all took off. We didn't look back. We couldn't. The wind howled in our ears, drowning out the sound of our own ragged breaths. But even amidst the storm, I could still hear it, footsteps, massive, thudding against the snow. The creature was behind us. I could feel it, closing the distance, like it was toying with us, letting us think we could escape before it hunted us down. It was too fast, too strong. No matter how fast we ran, it felt like it was right there, on our heels. I looked to my left and saw Matt stumble. His legs gave way beneath him as he tried to push through the snow. He cried out, reaching for the rest of us. But it was too late. The creature was there in an instant. I don't know what happened next, but I heard his scream, a guttural, piercing scream that froze the blood in my veins. And then, nothing. Only silence. We didn't stop. We couldn't. We reached the base camp, breathless, stumbling, our hearts racing. We were safe, for now. But the terror didn't end there. It didn't end when we reached the camp. The thing had followed us. I knew it. It wasn't done. We spent the night huddled in our tents, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to even speak. I kept hearing things, footsteps in the snow, the soft scrape of something moving just outside the tents. But each time I looked, there was nothing there. The storm had calmed, the winds had settled, but the presence, whatever that thing was still there, lingering just out of sight. The next morning, we gathered our things, packed up, and left. We didn't talk about it. Not really. We didn't have to. It was in our eyes, in the way we moved, the way we avoided looking at each other. We knew. We never spoke of it again, not even after we returned home. But I know what we saw. I know what we felt. That thing, that creature, it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something older, something that belonged in those mountains, something that had always been there, hiding in the snow, waiting for the right moment to show itself. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes, those glowing, malevolent eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. And I know that thing is still out there, somewhere in the Andes, watching, waiting. Story number 7. The Snowman of the Arctic Village. I wasn't sure why I had come back to this place. Maybe it was the nostalgia, or maybe it was the stories I'd heard about the strange creature that haunted the village. Either way, something about the snow-covered landscape seemed to call to me, like an old memory I couldn't shake. I'm Jake, and this is a story I've never told anyone. Not because I think people wouldn't believe me. No, it's because I still can't wrap my mind around it. What happened that winter in the Arctic village? Something out there, something unnatural, has been following me ever since, and I'm afraid it will never stop. It started when I decided to take a trip back to the small village in the far north. The village had always fascinated me. It wasn't much of a tourist destination, just a dot on the map, isolated from the world, where people lived simple lives, scraping by in the harsh, frozen landscape. The locals had always whispered about the snowman. They called it the snow beast. But it was never clear whether they were talking about a legend or something real. The stories I'd heard as a kid, stories passed around the fire, had stayed with me. They talked about a creature that was not quite human, not quite animal, something that could blend into the snow so perfectly that it seemed to disappear, only to reappear when it was least expected. A creature with eyes like burning coals, eyes that could see through the coldest of nights. I didn't believe those stories when I was young, not until I went back to the village. The first night I arrived, the wind was biting, slicing through my jacket as I made my way from the small, frozen airport to the town center. The village was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of my boots on the thick snow. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath. The houses sat like silent sentinels, their chimneys puffing out faint trails of smoke into the twilight sky. I rented a room at the local inn, a place with peeling wallpaper and a fireplace that did little more than add to the damp chill in the air. The old woman behind the counter greeted me with a half-hearted smile, her eyes darting nervously to the window as if expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. "Not many outsiders come this time of year," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, unsure if I should ask about the snowman. Felt silly, childish even, but something about this place made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I hear the storm's coming," I said, trying to change the subject. "Storm's nothing," she muttered. "The real storm comes when it's quiet, when there's no wind, and everything's still." I raised an eyebrow, but she didn't elaborate further. She just handed me the key to my room and went back to staring out the window. That night, the snow fell heavily, blanketing the village in an endless sea of white. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, listening to the faint creaks of the building settling, the howling wind outside pushing the snow against the window. It was the kind of night where you could hear every breath you took. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a scraping noise, like something or someone was moving in the snow. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound was faint, but it was there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the dark expanse of the village. The streetlights barely cut through the falling snow, and the world outside was a blur of whiteness. But I saw it, just for a moment. There was a shape, something tall and hulking, moving in the distance. It was too big to be a person, too fast to be an animal. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was there one moment, then gone the next, swallowed by the snow. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I went to the local diner for breakfast. The town seemed even quieter than before. The faces around the room were all familiar, too familiar. It was as if nothing had changed in years. But they all looked at me as if I were an outsider, a stranger who didn't belong. You saw it, didn't you? The old man sitting across from me asked, his voice low. I glanced up, surprised. Saw what? The snow beast, he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. That's why you're here, isn't it? I stared at him for a long time, unsure of how to respond. I hadn't told anyone why I was here, but somehow, this old man knew. The snow beast, he continued, has been here for as long as anyone can remember, and it's never left. Not really. It's out there right now, watching you, watching all of us. I laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. You're telling me that thing is real? The man didn't smile. His face remained grave, the lines around his eyes deepening. It's not a thing. It's not some mythical creature. It's something else. I didn't know what to say. He must have seen the doubt in my eyes because he leaned forward and whispered, "We don't talk about it here. We don't speak of the snow beast. It's better that way." But I didn't want to leave it at that. "What does it want?" I asked. The man looked away, his gaze turning toward the window, as though the question itself was dangerous. "It wants what it always wants," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wants to be fed." I didn't understand at first, but later that evening, when the storm raged outside, I began to understand. I had been exploring the outskirts of the village when I noticed something strange in the snow. A set of tracks, massive footprints, too large to belong to any human or animal. They were deep in the snow, as though whatever had left them was heavier than anything that should be able to move in this cold. They led toward the edge of the forest, where the trees stood like sentinels, tall and foreboding. Curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the tracks until I came to a clearing. The wind had died down, and the snow was eerily still. It was then that I heard it, the growl, low and deep. It seemed to come from the ground itself. A growl so powerful it made my chest vibrate. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my legs unwilling to move. And then, I saw it. The creature stepped out from behind a cluster of trees, its massive form emerging from the shadows. It was covered in thick, matted fur, the color of snow, but darker gray, almost black. Its eyes burned with a fiery intensity, glowing in the darkness. It was taller than any man, towering over me, his body hunched like a beast, but its face was human, twisted, his features long and sharp like a predator. The snow beast, the thing the villagers had whispered about for generations. It stepped closer, its breath misting in the cold air, and I could feel the weight of its gaze. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. It was then that I heard the scream. It came from the village. A woman, her voice breaking with fear, a cry that echoed through the trees. And before I knew it, the snow beast turned, its eyes flickering toward the direction of the village. Without a word, It bolted, faster than I could blink. It was gone, moving through the snow with terrifying speed, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I didn't follow it. I didn't dare. I turned and ran back to the village, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I got back, the villagers were already boarding up their windows and doors, locking themselves inside. "What's happening?" I asked, breathless. One of them, the old woman from the inn, looked at me with tears in her eyes. "It's back," she whispered. "The snow beast is hungry." I didn't understand then, but as the night wore on, the sounds outside grew louder, the growls, the footsteps. It wasn't just one creature. There were more. They were hunting. And as the snow piled higher, the world outside grew darker. And I knew then that I wasn't just an observer in this place. I had become a part of the hunt. I don't know if I'll ever leave this place. No one does. Not once you've seen the snow beast. Not once you've heard the screams in the night. Story number 8. The Snowman of Vermont. I don't know if I believe in monsters. I don't think anyone really does, at least not until they come face to face with something that should never exist, something that can't be explained. I know I didn't. Not before the winter of 2003, when my life, my understanding of everything, changed in a way I couldn't have predicted. My name's Alex, and the story I'm about to tell you is the reason I'll never be the same. I wish I could say it was a bad dream, or that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. What happened in those woods in Vermont was real. Too real. It was late December when my girlfriend, Kelly, and I decided to take a road trip through the Vermont countryside. We'd been living in New York City for a few months, both working ridiculous hours. So we thought it would be nice to get out of the city for a weekend. A winter getaway, just the two of us, driving through the mountains, the thick woods, and the quiet charm of the Vermont countryside. Kelly always had a way of making everything seem magical. She loved the cold, loved the snow. Me, I was a city boy, but for her, I'd do anything. So we packed up my old Subaru and hit the road. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, a blanket of white covering everything around us. We stopped at a small cafe in Middlebury for lunch, ate sandwiches by the fire, and talked about everything and nothing. By the time we got back on the road, the sky had turned that soft shade of lavender as dusk began to settle over the land. That's when the trouble started. We were driving along Route 125, winding through the dense forest, the headlights illuminating the snow-covered road. It was just us, the car, and the trees, and then we saw it. I was behind the wheel, and Kelly was leaning back, looking out the window, lost in her own thoughts. That's when I noticed it, a figure, standing right in the middle of the road. First, I thought it was a bear, maybe a moose, or even a person wrapped in a thick winter coat. But when I turned the wheel slightly to get a better look, my blood froze. It wasn't a person. It was big, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in these woods. Its fur was white, but not like snow. It looked thick, like it had been built for the cold, for survival. And its eyes, Jesus, its eyes, they were glowing, like two fiery coals burning through the dark. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop just a few feet from it. For a moment, Kelly was silent. I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It stood there, unmoving, in the middle of the road, as if it had every right to be there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. The car's headlights bathed it in light, but it didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice us. I looked over at Kelly. She was staring at the creature, her face pale. "Alex," she whispered, "what is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I slowly reached for the gear shift, trying to back up. But before I could do anything, the creature moved. It didn't just step aside. It didn't scurry away like some wild animal might. No, it moved with purpose, and it moved fast. In an instant, it was charging toward the car. I didn't have time to react. It hit the car with a force that felt like a freight train slamming into us. The whole car shook, the sound of metal crunching echoing in the night. The creature's fist, or whatever it was, pounded down on the hood with such power that it left a deep, dented imprint. The noise was deafening. I heard Kelly scream, and I slammed the car into reverse, desperately trying to get away. But the creature wasn't done. It let out a roar, deep, guttural, almost animalistic, and lunged at the car. It hit the front bumper, sending us jerking backward, the wheels spinning on the icy road. In that instant, I thought we were done. I thought the creature was going to tear us apart right there. But then it stopped. The beast stepped back, its glowing eyes still fixed on us. And for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind howling through the trees. The creature didn't make another move. It didn't charge again. It just stood there, watching us, and then, without another sound, turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the thick dark of the forest. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the gear shift, pulling the car into drive. Kelly was crying next to me, her face white as a ghost, her hands clutching the door handle like she wanted to run. "Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know." I didn't even know how to explain it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It was something else. Something unnatural. Something that didn't belong in the world I knew. I managed to drive us back to town, to the nearest gas station. But neither of us spoke much. We were both too rattled. We didn't even stop to get gas. I just kept driving, our tires crunching over the snow, the landscape swallowed up by the night. But when we reached the station, something hit me, something I hadn't noticed in all the chaos. The hood of the car. It was dented, yes, but not just that. There were scratches, long, deep gouges, as if something had raked its claws down the metal. And there, in the snow around the car, were huge, human-like footprints. They led off into the trees. We spent the night in a nearby motel, but neither of us slept. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something was watching us. Kelly kept saying that it wasn't real, that we'd both just imagined it. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had attacked us. I kept thinking about the eyes, those glowing, fiery eyes, and that roar. God, I could still hear it, vibrating in my chest. The next morning, we tried to drive back home, but neither of us spoke about what had happened. It was as if saying it out loud would make it real in a way we weren't ready for. We didn't mention the footprints or the scratches on the car. We just tried to put it behind us. But it wasn't over. The day we returned to the city, something strange happened. Kelly started having nightmares. Bad ones, night after night. She would wake up screaming, her hands clawing at the sheets, and she kept saying the same thing. The eyes, they're still out there. And me, I've never been able to forget that night. I thought I was just going crazy, but over the next few weeks, I started hearing stories, whispers from locals, from truckers, from hunters who'd been up there in the woods. They spoke of a creature, a snowman, a beast that only comes out when the snow falls heavy and the moon is full. They called it the Snowman of Vermont. They said it had been there long before we ever drove through, lurking in the trees, watching, waiting, and they said it would never forget the scent of fear. I don't know if that thing will ever come after us again. I don't know if it's out there, in the woods of Vermont, waiting for the next car to drive by. But I can tell you one thing, I'm never going back to that place. Not for any reason. Not ever. Story number 9. The White Beast of the Himalayas. I don't tell this story often. Maybe it's because I still can't make sense of what happened that night. Or maybe it's because the nightmares haven't stopped haunting me since. But the truth is, no matter how many years have passed since 1972, the events of that expedition are as vivid to me as if they happened yesterday. My name is Michael Sterling, and I was part of a small team of explorers who ventured into the Himalayas that winter. We weren't the first group to brave those mountains, But we were driven by a mix of curiosity and the old legends that had swirled around the Yeti for decades. We thought it was all folklore, stories to scare children. But by the time we left the mountains, we knew better. The journey started like any other. We flew into Kathmandu, then made our way up to the base camp, which was already covered in thick layers of snow. We were equipped for everything: blizzards, avalanches, and the altitude. There were 5 of us in total: Rick, our leader, Sarah, the biologist, Doug, the geologist, John, the photographer, and me, Michael, a history graduate with a penchant for adventure. We had come to the Himalayas to study the geological formations and possibly find ancient artifacts hidden in the caves that dotted the mountain range. But like all explorers, there was that underlying curiosity, an urge to search for the unknown, for the Yeti, for something bigger than ourselves. We'd been climbing for days, moving slowly but steadily. The wind howled through the jagged peaks. The snow swirled around us in relentless gusts, and the cold was a constant companion. Despite the harsh conditions, we made camp each night, huddling together in our tents for warmth and company. It was on the 4th night, as we settled into our makeshift camp in a narrow valley, that everything began to change. I remember it clearly. The wind had died down for once, and an eerie silence had settled over the camp. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the occasional rustle of snow outside. It was then that I heard it. The first sound was faint, barely audible at first, like the shifting of snow under heavy weight. Then it became louder, the sound of something moving, heavy, deliberate steps in the snow, like a predator stalking its prey. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I could hear Sarah and Doug stir in their tents as well. Rick was already awake, his breathing shallow, his ear to the ground like a wolf sensing danger. I slid out of my sleeping bag and slowly unzipped the flap of the tent, careful not to make a sound. The air was so cold that the breath caught in my throat, crystallizing as it escaped my mouth. Outside, the snow was thick, the world cast in a ghostly blue glow from the moonlight. And then I saw it. First, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow too large, too distorted, against the backdrop of the mountains. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer, and what I saw froze me in place. It was standing at the edge of our camp, just beyond the glow of our lanterns, at least 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick white fur that blended seamlessly with the snow. Its face was grotesque, covered in a layer of dark matted hair, with glowing yellow eyes that gleamed in the dark. Its mouth was wide, revealing large, jagged teeth, and its hands, if you could call them that, were massive, with long, bony fingers that reached down to the snow like claws. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic in my chest. I could hear the others behind me now, their breaths quickening, their voices low and tense. "Do you see it?" John whispered, his voice hoarse. "I see it," Rick murmured, his tone a mix of awe and fear. "Don't move. Stay quiet." The creature stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at us through the thin fabric of the tent. It made no sound, its breath visible in the cold air, rising like smoke. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but one question stood out above all. What was it? Sarah had always dismissed the Yeti as a myth. She had even laughed at the idea when we discussed it during the hike. But now, in the presence of this creature, I could feel the cold certainty settling in. This was no myth. Whatever it was real. Suddenly, the creature moved. Its large, clawed foot lifted off the ground, and it took a step forward. We all froze. A low growl rumbled in its chest, vibrating through the snow like distant thunder. And then, before any of us could react, it stepped back and vanished into the night, swallowed by the darkness. "Get the lights," Rick ordered, his voice sharp, betraying the fear he was trying to control. We scrambled for the flashlights, fumbling in the cold, our hands shaking. John managed to click his on first. The beam cut through the snow, But the creature was gone. There was nothing, just the snow, the cold, and the echo of the growl still hanging in the air. We didn't sleep that night. We kept the lights on, scanning the surrounding area, but nothing else came. The wind picked up again, and soon, the sounds of the mountains returned to normal. The next morning, we decided to move out. We were all shaken, and no one wanted to stay another night in that place. But before we packed up camp, we checked the area where the creature had stood. That's when we saw it, massive footprints in the snow, each one as large as a manhole cover. The prints led off into the distance, toward the sheer cliffs of the valley. We followed the tracks for hours, though we didn't get far. They led to a dead end, a sheer drop into an abyss that no one had anticipated. And yet, the prints continued across the gap, as if the creature had simply stepped through the air itself. That was when we realized something was very wrong. We turned back, but as we made our way back to the camp, the dread that had settled over us deepened. There were no signs of the creature anymore, no footprints, no marks in the snow. It was as if it had never existed. But we knew better. We had seen it, and we knew it would be there, somewhere in the shadows, watching us. In the days that followed, we continued our trek through the mountains, but the atmosphere had changed. We were no longer the confident explorers that had arrived full of ambition and curiosity. Every rustle of snow, every creaking branch sent our nerves into overdrive. We were being hunted, and we knew it. On the last night of our journey, just before we were to head back to civilization, the creature came again. We heard it long before we saw it, the heavy steps in the snow, the growl reverberating through the mountains. This time, we weren't caught off guard. We set up a defensive perimeter, with our weapons ready, but the creature never attacked. It stayed just beyond our camp, circling us, its glowing eyes watching from the darkness. The following morning, we were gone. None of us spoke of what happened that night, but we all knew that it wasn't a dream. The creature was real, and it wasn't going to leave us alone. I never went back to the Himalayas after that. None of us did. We all agreed that what we had encountered wasn't just a Yeti or a simple mountain creature. It was something older, something that belonged to the mountains and to the night. Years later, I read reports from other expeditions in the same region. Some of them spoke of strange footprints in the snow, others of distant, echoing roars. But the one thing they all had in common was the terror they felt. The Yeti was no longer a myth. It was a reality, and I, Michael Sterling, was one of the few who had stared into its eyes and lived to tell the tale. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the growl, echoing through the mountains, waiting for the next expedition.